Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to Time with PIAC. Today we are discussing one of the funds that was created by the Petroleum Revenue Management Act 2011, Act 815. That is the Ghana Heritage Fund. This fund was created purposely for the benefits of future generations when the country's petroleum resources have been fully utilized. There have been concerns as to why keep the fund when you can draw down now and invest for the benefits of future generations. Today on Time with PIAC, we take a critical look at what the law says on the fund and whether it can or should be drawn down or left untouched. My guest today is Mr. Isaac Dramna, the coordinator of PIAC, who will take us through this discussion. Remember, you can send in your questions and comments as the discussion progresses, and we will respond to them. This is Time with PIAC, and I'm your host, Jessica Echampon. So I have here with me Mr. Isaac Dramna, the coordinator of PIAC. Hello, sir. You're welcome to Time with PIAC.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Jessica, and good afternoon to all our viewers.
Great. So we just set the discussion rolling. Today we are talking about the Ghana Heritage Fund. Can you just educate our viewers on what that fund is about?
Thank you once again for the opportunity. So when we go back into history, in 2007, when the announcement was made that Ghana had found oil in commercial quantities, discussions began across the country. Surveys were conducted, workshops were organized, conferences were held to solicit views of citizens on how the revenues that were to flow from the exploitation of the resource were to be utilized, to be invested, to be managed. So civil society, religious groups, traditional groups, all kinds of citizens were consulted on how these revenues were to be managed. And in the surveys conducted, 54.8% of the respondents to the survey said that two distinct funds should be created. One for stabilization, that is to be kept in such a state that it could be easily fallen upon when revenues expected are not realized. And one particular fund that would be invested and not touched until after some time. So the first fund that was to be kept in such a state that it could be falling upon if revenues expected were not realized ended up becoming the Ghana Stabilization Fund. And then the other fund that was not to be touched until after some time became the Ghana Heritage Fund. So the Ghana Heritage Fund, I would say, is the outcome of views of Ghanaians on how revenues that were to flow from the exploitation of the resource should be managed, should be saved, should be invested, so that the fund becomes a benefit flowing from the exploitation of the resource. Because usually with natural resource, you are not just looking at the revenue you are spending today. You are looking at how you manage the revenue such that the revenue becomes another revenue making mechanism upon which you live when the resource is depleted. So that is the brief about the Ghana Heritage Fund. Let me add that it is also intended to be an endowment fund for the future generation. So it was intended to be kept not for the current generation, but to be kept until the petroleum resource had been entirely depleted. Then it would come in to be utilized in accordance with the provisions of the Petroleum Revenue Management Act.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Dramna. So you mentioned the fund is supposed to receive, the Ghana Heritage Fund is supposed to receive funds from petroleum revenues. Did the law make any explicit provision on the percentage and how much has gone into the fund since 2011 that it was established?
Okay, thank you. So if you look at the provisions of the PRMA, and we'll keep referring to the PRMA in this case, Act 815, the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, it says that every year the Minister for Finance is to do an estimate of how much crude oil is to be produced, then how much gas is to be produced. Then the minister is to do an estimate of how much the crude oil is to be sold on the world market. And based on that, determine what the Act calls the benchmark revenue. The benchmark revenue is essentially the revenue targeted after the bit that is supposed to go to the National Oil Company has been allocated to it. So the Act provides that not more than 55% of net carried and participating interest is to be given to the National Oil Company. Currently, by a decision of Parliament, it's about 40% of carried and participating interest that is given to GMPC. So what is left of the carried and participating interest, which is the 60%, plus all other revenue sources, now come together to form a new 100%. That is what the Act calls the benchmark revenue. The Act says that not more than 70% of the benchmark revenue is to be allocated and spent in the budget. Now, the 30% remaining is to be allocated to what the Act calls the Ghana Petroleum Funds, which is like a merger, the amalgamation of the Ghana Stabilization Fund and the Ghana Heritage Fund. So it is 30% of the benchmark revenue. Now, the Act provides that when the 30% is set aside, not more than 70% of that is to be allocated to the Ghana Stabilization Fund, or let me do it the derivative, because actually that's what the Act provides for. The Act says that not less than 30% of the benchmark revenue is to be allocated to the Ghana Heritage Fund. Then not more than 70% goes to the Ghana Stabilization Fund. So these are the provisions, the more like the mathematics behind the allocations to the Ghana Civilization Fund and the Ghana Heritage Fund.
That looks like some complex mathematics, 30%, 70%, but I'm sure our viewers understand the dynamics of what you have said so far. So how much has the fund received? According to this calculation that we attempted doing, how much has the fund received since 2011?
Okay, so since 2011, the fund has made $1 billion and 50 million US dollars, 1.05 billion US dollars. That is how much has come into the fund, plus how much has been generated in terms of returns on the fund. Yes, this is from 2011, since the fund was established.
And is it up to the end of 2023?
Yes, this is till the end of December 2023. Yes, December 2023.
So this is still Time with PIAC. If you are just joining us today, we are talking about the Ghana Heritage Fund, and our guest is Mr. Isaac Jomna, the coordinator of PIAC. He just gave us a brief background to the establishment of the fund and how much is the balance as at the end of 2023. So we move on then. Mr. Jomna, which investment instruments are the GHF supposed to be invested in? Was the law very clear on that?
Yes. So the Act provides that the fund is to be invested in qualifying instruments. And you know, qualifying instruments does not mean much in finance and in investment. So you are aware, and viewers are aware, that it is the Bank of Ghana that manages and invests the fund, both the Stabilization Fund and the Heritage Fund. In fact, there is a unit of the Bank of Ghana that invests these funds. Now, the funds of the Heritage Fund are invested in the US Treasury bonds. They're also invested in agency bonds, in supranational bonds, and then in sovereign bonds. But let's underscore the fact that funds are held in such a way that you are looking for opportunities to take advantage of. So where you are sure that you're going to get very stable income flowing to the fund from the investment you have made, and the investment is not that one day you have interest rising so high, then the next day it falls so low, but you get interest very stable. Those are the funds that you would invest these sovereign wealth funds. In the management of funds, fund managers are looking for investment opportunities to invest the funds in, to reward them for the risk they are taking in investing. So not too high a risk, but then commensurate reward for the risk taking. So it is the reason behind the investment in these instruments, these investment instruments. The intention is primarily to save. It is more of a saving fund. So we are not investing the funds in such a way that the primary thing you are looking at is the interest. You are rather putting the monies aside with a view to primarily saving for the future generations. It's the reason behind these instruments, because they are not instruments that are the high yielding instruments. If you look at Norway, for instance, their sovereign wealth funds, they have invested them in a number of instruments outside their jurisdiction. But the primary thing is to look for investment opportunities in such a way that the fund will be able to grow from the returns that are generated on the fund. So they invest in IT bonds. I mean, in companies that have invested in ITs, because when they look at an industry that is thriving, that looks promising, then they will invest in these industries so that the fund will be able to grow. The last time I checked, I think their sovereign wealth fund had a balance of about 1.6 trillion US dollars. So the 0.6 alone is 600 billion. So that's a lot of money. And Ghana, the Ghana Heritage Fund just crossed 1 billion. So you can do the comparison and see where we are in relation to Norway.
Okay, but Mr. John, let me play the devil's advocate here. You mentioned that the GHF, we are investing it primarily to save.
Yes.
And not really looking at the interest that is going to come in. Mm-hmm. So why don't we save it in Ghana?
Well, it is not a bad idea in itself, but most of the sovereign wealth funds you read about in countries are invested outside their jurisdictions. Okay. You are looking at the safety of the instrument. You are looking at the ability of the government to discipline itself to keep to the investment and not be tempted beyond its ability to touch the funds. Even though there are rules governing it, it takes a decision of parliament to change the saving rules. So most sovereign wealth funds the world over are invested outside the jurisdictions of the sovereign wealth fund with the view to taking advantage of investment opportunities. So even though the Heritage Fund may be considered as a saving fund, you don't just put it aside for putting aside, say, because you know there's something in economics and investment we call the time value of money. When you put money aside and you don't invest it, over time it loses its value. So there is need for it to be invested in instruments so that the value is protected, the value is saved.
Okay, so was the law very clear that we limit these investments to just the countries that we have spoken about, or the bonds, or there are others that we can invest in, but we are yet to explore those options?
Yes, so like I said, the Act provides that the funds are to be invested in qualifying instruments. You know, the Minister for Finance is the one giving the responsibility to invest the funds upon the advice of the Investment Advisory Committee. So the Minister for Finance, together with the Bank of Ghana, have the mandate to invest. The decision is theirs to make, and the Act does not limit us to a particular country. As long as we identify an instrument as qualifying by the criteria they have determined, then they will invest the Ghana Heritage Fund in it. But the underlying principle is also that these are long-term investments. The Act provides that the Ghana Heritage Fund shall not be touched within 15 years. So if we shall touch the fund at all, it should be after 15 years. So until then, it's all going into the fund, and not any withdrawal from the fund. Yes.
Okay, so we'll come to the withdrawal bit shortly, where we will go into details, because that has been the subject of controversy, if I would say, whether we should withdraw it or whether we should keep saving it. But you just hold your breath. We'll come to that very, very soon.
All right.
So you mentioned earlier that as at the end of 2023, we had 1.05 billion US dollars in the Ghana Heritage Fund.
You're right.
That is the monies that went from the PHF plus interest that has come in.
Yes.
That's correct.
Yes.
So is this 1.5 intact, or there has been some withdrawals?
Based on the information made available to the Public Interest and Accountability Committee by the Bank of Ghana, these funds are intact. The balance of 1.05 billion standing to the credit of the Ghana Heritage Fund is intact. At least based on the information provided, PIAC can assure the citizens of Ghana that the Ghana Heritage Fund has the balance that we say it has, the 1.05 billion US dollars.
Okay. But Mr. Jamla, we know that PIAC is a very strong advocate of not touching the Heritage Fund. So is this position of PIAC backed by any provision in the PRMA?
Yes, so lawyers call something the spirit of the law. It's about the intention of the lawmaker. It's about what led the lawmaker to make the law. So why was the Ghana's Heritage Fund established? It is true, it is a fund for the future generation. But we are also looking at the fact that, like I said earlier, not only what is accrued to be utilized today, but funds you will build up, the interest of which, or the returns of which, will become a source of revenue that will fund government's budget beyond the lifespan of the asset itself, beyond the lifespan of the resource. If you look at United Arab Emirates, they have now, the revenue the government gets from tourism is even becoming more than what they get from oil and gas. I see Saudi Arabia building their economy towards the same direction. So they are decreasing their dependence on the natural resource so that they have built a fund, the returns of which will become the regular source of income for the government beyond the lifespan of the resource. I think this should be the primary thing that should guide the management of the Heritage Fund. And it is the underlying principle upon which PIAC thinks that the fund should not be touched. If you look at Norway, for instance, for the year 2022 or so, the return on the fund that went to support the budget was 213 billion US dollars. It's just a return on the fund, 213 billion US dollars. So they built their fund so much so that the return on the fund is a very big support for their budget. I think we should not just look at the act saying that a certain percentage of the petrol revenue should be paid into the Heritage Fund. We should have a target. We should have an aim and a strategy around it that probably by the 20th year from 2011, we want to build the fund and get 2 billion US dollars. How do we get there? Every year we set it aside. After all, the act says that the minimum is 9%. So it means that government can decide that we are putting aside 12% every year to be able to attain the target of 2 billion US dollars by the 20th year, so that then the interest that it accrues, if over 2011 to 2023, the returns is 119 million US dollars, and you build the fund to 2 billion US dollars, how much will you be getting on it, so that you improve the capacity of the fund to bring you more to be able to support the budget? Then you decrease your dependence on the resource, the natural resource, which is an exhaustible resource and will run out one day. Yes, so it is the reasoning behind the committee's strong stance that the Ghana Heritage Fund should not be touched, at least not within the 15 years provided for by the Act.
Okay, but maybe for the benefits of our viewers, we want to give them some bit of education. Are there very specific provisions in the PRMA on as to whether we can draw down on the Heritage Fund or not? What exactly does the law say on that?
Okay, thank you. So that I would say there are two arms of, or two, I won't say two provisions, but there are two sides to it. The Act provides that in the case of national emergencies, the Parliament of Ghana can pass a law that would allow for withdrawal to be made from the Ghana Heritage Fund. That is one. But the Act also provides in sections 21, 1, 2, 3, thereabout, that the Ghana Heritage Fund is not to be touched from 2011 to 2026. That is 15 years from the establishment of the fund. But it provides that 1 year after the petroleum resource has been depleted, the Ghana Stabilization Fund and the Ghana Heritage Fund should be merged to become the Ghana Petroleum World Fund. And then the interest that is accrued on this fund is what is to go to support the budget, now called the annual budget funding amount. So then it means that the amount of money that will support the budget one day will be dependent on how much we are able to accrue on the Ghana Heritage Fund and the Ghana Stabilization Fund. So the future depends on the present. If we're able to build the fund very well, then we can be assured that the returns on the balance on the fund as at the time the resource will run out will be good enough to support the budget. Otherwise, it will get to a point where the support of these funds to the budget will become like a pittance. The nation's dependence will have to necessarily be very little, because then the balance on the fund will be very, very small. So that is what the Act provides for with regards to the fund. Let me also say that the Act also provides that beyond the 15 years, the Act provides that Parliament can pass a law to allow for interest on the funds generated be used. So in that case, the principal still stays, but it is the interest generated on the principal that Parliament will allow to be utilized. But even in that case, it has to be a decision of Parliament. The executive cannot just decide to utilize the fund.
Okay, so we are getting to the end of our conversation, but before we let Mr. Jomna go, he's advanced some very cogent arguments on why we should leave the GHF untouched. But Mr. Jomna, the advocates of let's use the fund now, their point is we can still use the Ghana Heritage Fund to do projects that future generations will still get to benefit.
Yes, that is a plausible argument to make, but the needs of today may not necessarily be the needs of tomorrow. If we look back 10 years ago, the needs of the country at that time may be significantly different from the needs of the country today. So it is better to build the fund for the future. Then when it gets to when the resource has been depleted, they themselves, the citizens themselves, will decide how they want to put the fund to use. The resource belongs to us as much as it belongs to the future generations. So let's do good projects today. I don't say that to mean we should do shoddy projects just for our generation. The projects we do today with about 70% of the funds should last until they benefit. But let's also leave the 9% that is currently being put aside to them, so that their needs that will be peculiar to them, they will see to them with that. I've heard some argument from certain quarters. Some have said that how can we be saving when we have current needs? Okay. But you don't say that because you have current needs, you don't save. You spend everything you get. Even in the midst of insufficiency, you should apply the discipline of saving for the future. Then I've heard some people say that when you educate the people of today, you are developing them for the future. Educating them today is still current usage, current utilization. Let's, in accordance with the provisions of the Act, set aside at least the minimum. But I think that just like PIAC has held up, we should go beyond the minimum and save more for the future, so that whatever will come off as the interest on the fund will be greater for them to benefit, to support their budget.
Okay, so this has been Time with PIAC, and we have been talking about the Ghana Heritage Fund. My guest was Mr. Isaac Jobna, the coordinator of PIAC, who's made some very laudable arguments in relation to the fact that we should not touch the Heritage Fund. But finally, before we let Mr. Jobna go, in just 1 minute, maybe you'd have changed your mind after this discussion. Should we draw down on the Ghana Heritage Fund, or we should continue saving?
Okay, so here I have no personal view. I am in strong linkage with PIAC's view that the fund should not be drawn down. We should continue saving, and I add my voice to PIAC's stance that we should even go beyond the minimum we've been doing since 2011 and build the fund up, because when the resource is depleted, we shall be depending on the interest on the principal, and so the strength of the principal will determine how much will be generated to support the budget. So it should not be drawn down upon. We should build the fund. We should actually set ourselves a target that, let's say, by 20 years from 2011 we will have reached $2 billion, and we should work towards it and go beyond just 9%. Yes, that's what I would like to conclude with.
Okay. So undoubtedly, the Ghana Heritage Fund remains critical in the management and use of Ghana's petroleum revenues. And today we touched on what the fund is, the relevance of the fund, what is the balance as at the end of 2023, and whether we should draw down on it or continue saving. My guest, Mr. Isaac Jobna, who's the coordinator of PIAC, has made very strong arguments that let us build the fund now and then use it in the future to benefit the future generations. Thank you all for joining us in this all-important conversation. Connect with us via any of our channels: Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram at PIAC Ghana. Our WhatsApp number 055-441-6544 is always active. You can send your questions or your comments and we will respond to them. I was your host, Jessica Echampon. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the day.